right. Good evening, everybody. We're super excited to have you on again. I can see some people still trickling through, so we'll take a second. Just for an introduction, my name is Mallory. Welcome to 5 night of the webinar series. We're super excited to have you again. Tonight we have Dr. Troy Rowan, our assistant professor here in the animal science department, and our beef cattle genomics specialist here for the state. He's here to talk to us tonight about beef cattle sustainability and really owning that narrative. And so with that all being said, I'll let Troy take the floor. Just a couple of housekeeping things before he gets started too. If you have any questions, be sure to send those in the Q&A box, and Dr. Rowan or I will be sure to get those answered. Your attendance is being automatically recorded through Zoom, and if you have any other questions, again, just be sure to use that Q&A box, but I'll let him get started. Thanks, Dr. Rowan.
All right. Thanks, Mallory. I'm going to go ahead and, can you give me permission to share my screen?
Yes.
Maybe.
Okay. Should be able to now.
Yep. There we go. All right. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I kind of got thrown a curveball. If you've been to a Master Beef before that I've spoken at, it's probably been about genetics or genomics or something along those lines. But Katie, as she was organizing this round of webinar series, asked me if I'd talk a little bit about sustainability. It's a subfield that in my lab, we've sort of waded into a little bit recently. So I guess my disclaimer before I start things off here is that I'm by no means a beef cattle sustainability expert. I borrow from a couple of sources that really are experts, and I think do a great job of framing this narrative of beef cattle sustainability, sort of where we are, areas that maybe we can do some work on. But really, I just want to focus this talk tonight really generally on sort of what the state of sustainability is, right? Where are we getting pressure from, whether that's from the government, from the media, from our consumers, areas that we can tie up, maybe some sustainability challenges. But most importantly, the big takeaway that I want you all to have tonight is that this sustainability word isn't a dirty word, right? This is something that I think we all already strive for, but some early branding, some impactful news stories over the last couple of decades have really put maybe a sour taste in some of our mouths as we think about sustainability. We get defensive. So my goal with tonight's presentation is to give you some tools to understand what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability. As well as we start communicating with our consumers, talking to a random person on the street about our industry, I think that we've got an awesome sustainability story to tell. And so I just really want to equip us to go out and do that. So with that, I am going to just go ahead and get started here. So the way I always like to start talking about sustainability is through the lens of sustainable plant-based protein. This always gets a gasp or two in a live audience, right? But when I talk about sustainable plant-based protein to a person on the street, they probably think of something like this. This is just a random screenshot from a textbook that a bunch of food scientists have put out, right? Engineering plant-based food systems, sustainable plant-based protein sources and their extraction, right? And that just, to me, sounds a little bit nasty. And I think about this little green smoothie thing, right? Plant-based protein, there's certainly a place for it. But when we think about a future food system that has plant-based protein in it, I have to think that we've been doing this for a really, really long time in the beef industry. And so if you take one thing away from tonight's talk, I think it should be this, right? We are sustainable. We've been sustainable, and we're getting more sustainable in our industry, right? The ecosystem services that these animals do, when they go out and take this field full of forage, right? This is land that's not arable. We can't go and plant a big vegetable garden out here, right? This is basically a wasteland if we don't have organisms out there that are capable of turning that low quality forage into a high quality product. So I'm sure if you've been around the industry and heard folks talk, you've heard them talk about cattle as upcyclers, right? This forage is not useful to us as humans, right? But cattle as an intermediary or other ruminants, you can think about sheep in the same way, or goats. They're able, due to being ruminants, right, take this inedible forage and convert it into energy and eventually into protein that is full of micronutrients, in an essential piece, I think, of the human diet in the past. And I see no reason that shouldn't be the same for us moving forward. So again, just keep in mind that when we're thinking about what sustainable plant-based protein looks like now and in the future, I really do think that beef cattle are going to play a critical role in feeding a growing world population. So I think in scientific talks, we always love to have our introductory slide be this: the world's population is rapidly growing. Where do we get 10 billion by the year 2050, right? We love to throw those numbers out, and it's true, right? There's a calorie threshold that we're going to have to reach as far as food production goes. But I think that the more important thing, even maybe, isn't just that we're going to have more mouths to feed, but it's that a large proportion of the global South is becoming more affluent, right? Countries that were struggling economically for decades and decades now have, at least partially developed economies. There's a growing middle class in the world, I think. And what that means is not only do people want to have their basic calorie needs met, but there's a demand for high quality protein. And I think that beef, particularly as we think about this growing population, is going to play a really, really important part. Maybe not every single night on the plates of this growing population, but certainly something that more and more people in the world are now economically able to afford, which is going to continue driving that demand for a high quality premium product like beef to be on the plates of more and more people across the world. So this demand that we've got for beef is not going to go away. And I think that's really important for us to consider as we sort of frame this sustainability narrative, right? This growing population is getting richer and they want higher quality proteins on their plate. And so for tonight's talk, I really want this to be the way I sort of reflected on it. I threw this slide in right at the very end. This Tennessee Master Beef Producer Program, this module maybe doesn't fit into some of the more traditional modules that you get as far as genetics or nutrition or animal health go, right? But I really think that what we talk about tonight will hopefully tie together a lot of these loose strings. And for a long time, we've actually had funding that's come to the Master Beef Program through the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that being a Tennessee master beef producer is no different than being a Tennessee sustainable beef producer, right? The things that we do that make us better beef producers, that make us more efficient, are the things that help us become more sustainable. And so as we talk about sustainability, I want you to keep that efficiency word in the back of your mind. We'll keep coming back to it over and over and over again, because I'm 100% convinced that the major driving factor towards being a more sustainable beef system is just being a more efficient system. And the ways that we do that are the things that you've heard us talk about here on Master Beef year after year. If you're a repeat Master Beef attendee, all of the things that we've talked about that make us more efficient in our herds, that make us more profitable, are also things that make us more sustainable. So again, these things aren't completely decoupled and working in opposite directions of one another. So these are my big goals for tonight as I sort of set up the rest of this presentation. The first is, I think we need to define sustainability. There's going to be maybe some slides in here that you might push back a little bit on me with, and I'm really happy to have a dialogue at the end, answer some questions, concerns that you have. But I think it's important that we get sort of a common definition of sustainability, but also understand the perspectives that folks, not only you and me, who are very passionate about the longevity and the critical niche that the beef industry occupies, right? But also the media. They have driven this narrative about beef cattle sustainability for a long time. And I'd really like, if we can get there, see where they're coming from, but in particular, understand where our consumers are coming from with their views on sustainability and how that might impact their demand for beef and how we can counter that narrative when given the opportunity. The next thing I want to talk about is how do we talk to consumers about this, right? I think I do some of my best consumer non-producer outreach when I'm sitting in an Uber to the airport, right? The driver asks me what I do. I say I do beef cattle genetics work, and he says, "Oh, beef cattle. Don't they like pollute the environment, right? Aren't they bad?" Or I've been a vegetarian because I care about the environment. But again, I do some of my best work, I think, when I can explain to him all the good sustainability stories that we have to tell as an industry. And it all starts with having some talking points, and I want to give you a handful of those so that you can do outreach not only in your communities, but as you get out in the world in your day-to-day lives, talking about the beef industry and our great sustainability stories. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about actionable and implementable practices that increase the sustainability of our operations. And I think the thing that's encouraging is that this isn't any different than the things that I would tell you if I were giving you a talk about how to breed a more efficient cow in your herd, right? I stole some slides from talks that I've given on that very topic. So again, this efficiency and sustainability going hand in hand. What are the concrete things that we can do to make our operations more sustainable? And then if we've got time, which I'm not sure that we will, I want to talk a little bit about some of the beef sustainability research that we're doing here at UT, just to give you a little glimpse at how we're going out and trying to deliver some of these solutions in the beef cattle sustainability space. So this is the question that I want to sort of have you think about for just a second. What does sustainability make you think of right off the bat? So when I say the word sustainability, right? What does that bring to mind in the context of beef cattle? And I'd venture to bet that the first thing that pops into mind, especially if you've got a little bit of a sour taste in your mouth regarding the word sustainability as it relates to beef cattle, is an article like this. This is the first time that I remember even thinking about sustainability tied to my family's livelihood, which was cattle ranching. And this is an article I reached into the Wayback Machine in the New York Times from 2008. And as I was doing the math, that probably lines up with the first time that I started hearing buzz about this. And this is when the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was exploring implementing some sort of a greenhouse gas tax on cows, right? And this was a huge shock, right? It came sort of out of nowhere, I think, to our industry. And they said, we're concerned about sustainability. Cows are emitters of greenhouse gases. We might tax them like we would tax another industry, like a power plant that emits greenhouse gases in the form of burning fossil fuels. And I remember again, our reaction to this was very much like, what the heck? We're not like a power plant, right? We're not like an auto manufacturer, right? These cows are living, breathing organisms. And this tax, right? The proposed tax at $175 a head per year for a dairy cow or something like $90 for a beef cow, that would put a ton of operations out of business, right? And this being our introduction to sustainability, to this green movement, whatever you want to call it, right? I think put a really bad taste in our mouth and put us on the defensive right off the bat. Luckily, this obviously didn't get implemented, but again, I think that as we consider sustainability and what we think about, oftentimes it harkens back to this cow tax, right? People started talking about cow farts, right? And I remember as a high schooler having to go and tell people, like, listen, they're not farts, they're burps. Cows are ruminants. So I've been doing this for a long time, explaining these things and trying to dispel some of these misconceptions about cows and how they operate in the sustainability space, right? So this is one that I think we can look back to a handful of years ago. More recently, right, I'm sure everybody who has a TV remembered the limited amount of time where this Burger King ad ran. The little kid who got famous for yodeling in Walmart makes up this song about cow farts and whatnot, and how Burger King is here to help, right? Again, this is a lot of consumers, particularly as you think who this is trying to appeal to a youth audience, to a younger group of folks who are very much online, right? And Burger King is saying, listen, cows are a problem, but we're doing something about it. And I think that this is outside sources who don't understand the industry like we do, who are able to drive the narrative, right? Whether that's the EPA with the regulation, whether that's Burger King with what I think is a very, very misleading advertisement, right? The narrative gets driven by all of these other outside sources, and at the end of the day, I believe it sets us back and put us on the defensive, and put a bad taste in our mouth when it comes to thinking and talking about sustainability. So I wanted for a second sort of reset that definition of sustainability. And I think it's really important that we frame it like this, because when we do, it immediately makes me think that, listen, there's nothing in these definitions of sustainability that we aren't already doing as beef cattle producers, right? So this is pulled from UCLA's sustainability website. Now, this is not a beef cattle sustainability website, just a very general a school from California, right? And their group of folks that think about sustainability. They say that sustainable practices support ecological, human, and economic health and vitality. And this definition, I think, is really, really important. Okay. This isn't just an environmental movement, the sustainability movement is. It really is focused on this holistic system that includes the people that operate in it. So as we think about the beef cattle industry, that's you as producers, that's folks that are involved in the feedlot space, in the packing and processing space, in the retail space, consumers. This sustainability is much bigger than just us. It needs to support ecological health, right? And I think that we'll talk a little bit more here later, but as beef cattle producers, we're great stewards of our land, and of the habitats of creatures that aren't cows that live there too, right? We're sort of the original environmentalists, right? So we care very deeply about this ecology, these grasslands that we call home. But also, this sustainability definition includes economic health and vitality, right? We can't go and sell out our souls just to make the environment perfect if there's not some sort of economic feedback, right? When we're sustainable, all of these things sort of live in harmony, right? We're helping the environment, the communities that live there, the people that interact with the system, and also we're allowing them to be economically viable, right? So that's really, really important. But the important thing here that I think that we need to think about is that sustainable practices assume that resources are finite. And that's really important, right? There's not an infinite amount of land. There's not an infinite amount of soil nutrients out there. There's not an infinite amount of anything, right? So these things are all finite. And in order to be sustainable, we need to use them conservatively and wisely, with a view towards the future, right? And again, I think this really perfectly encapsulates beef cattle production, because we're so interested not only in maximizing our resources, using them to their fullest capacity, but we've always got an eye on the future, right? What's the legacy that we get to leave behind as producers? And I know to so many of you, that's really, really important. Is there an industry? Is there an operation for me to leave future generations? And so sustainability, I think, really encapsulates all of those things. Whoops, wrong way. And so I want to add one more passage in here to help sort of frame this idea of sustainability in the farmer. And this is from a book that I'm reading right now. One of my favorite authors, Wendell Berry, an agriculturalist and author actually from Kentucky. I think it's fitting that Wendell has a picture of a field of grazing animals up here on top. His most recent book, The Unsettling of America. And this book is a book that challenges me a fair bit. There are a few things that I sort of scratch my head at or disagree with, but the thing that really stood out right at the very beginning of the book, Wendell starts to describe what he sees as the ideal of the farmer and their role as a nurturer in the environment. And I think that's really true for what we do in our industry. And so I'll read this out really quick. It's not a long passage, but he says that he'll lay out what he seems are the characteristics of these opposite kinds of mind. Conceives the strip miner to be a model exploiter, and as a model nurturer, he takes the old-fashioned idea of an ideal farmer. The exploiter is a specialist, an expert. The nurturer is not. The standard of the exploiter is efficiency. The standard of the nurturer is care. The exploiter's goal is money and profit. The nurturer's goal is health, his land's health, his own families, his communities, and his countries. And then whereas the exploiter asks a piece of land only how much and how quickly can it be made to produce, the nurturer asks the question that's much more complex and more difficult. What is the carrying capacity? That is, how much can be taken from it without diminishing it? What can it produce dependably for an indefinite amount of time? And I really love this for a couple of reasons. The first thing I'll point out is that my job title is literally specialist. Okay. So I'm up here, I'm preaching a gospel that I know I'm sort of working counter, right? I'm an expert in a very specific area, but you all as producers and nurturers of the land and the cattle that you have are not. You have a breadth of knowledge that's so wide, not only of those animals, but of the land, the other things that live on that land, and what that land can provide, right? And so I think that's really important way to frame what we do as a beef industry, right? As we nurture these ecosystems that allow us to produce food in the form of cattle, right? And the way that we do that is by understanding this health of the land, right? We don't want to overgraze, right? Because that puts us in a spot where we've exceeded that carrying capacity. We're taking more than we're able to put back into that soil. And eventually that's going to cause our production to decline, right? So again, I think this is sort of an idyllic view of things, but it's not far from reality, right? If we take more than we can put back in, eventually that resource is going to run out, and that's of course in the form of grass for us. We're beef producers, but at the end of the day, we're grass growers, and those cows are what are putting those nutrients that are stored in the grass, and turning them into an end product. So again, I really like this quote, and I like this way of thinking about a carrying capacity, particularly because he frames it in the context of indefinite time, right? How much can we take and ensure that this is still going to be around in the future? And so again, I think that we're the original sustainability experts, right? For forever, cattle producers have been interested in taking care of animals, right? And taking care of those ecosystems that animals live in, right? How do we nurture this animal while also making sure that we're not over exploiting our grazing lands? And we're of course also conscientious of the bigger environment in which these grazing lands are situated. We're improvers of animal breeding and management. So again, we'll keep coming back to this idea of efficiency being the biggest driver of sustainability. As we improve our management practices, that makes our animals more effectively able to use these finite resources. Again, we're producing more, but we're not over exploiting the resources that are available to us. We're economically responsible, right? I know on my family's operation, there are a lot of gates there, right, that are maybe past their time, right? We're very, I think, we're mindful of the present, but we're not going to sell out to jeopardize what we've got going in the future, right? So I think we're a very forward-looking industry. We're the last sort of major livestock industry that's not vertically integrated. I think for better, right? We're way more legacy oriented than any other agricultural commodity, and I will stand on a hill for that, right? We're generationally minded. We want to have these operations to pass down to our children, our children's children, and again, I think that that's at the core of sustainability. The way that I'll sort of frame this. From again, another definition is sustainable, right? But able to be upheld and defended. And to me, that's the core of what we're trying to do here, in all of our different ways and all of our different operations. How do we keep a beef industry around so that we've got one for our children, for our grandchildren, for our great grandchildren? As we look into the future, what are we doing to make sure that this industry stays viable? So to me, again, my sort of ultimate definition of sustainability has more to do with longevity than it does about environmental action, right? So again, just a way that I like to frame this thought process. And so, as we think about the longevity of the industry, there are a number of threats I think that we can look at. This is something that strategic planners do, right? They look at strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, right? So, I think we've got lots of opportunities in the industry to again continue to stay viable. We've got a growing population of folks that are wanting to eat beef as much as ever. We're doing more with less, which I'll come back to in a bit. But I think there are also plenty of threats to sustainability that we have to keep in mind, right? And so, first, when we think about this finite set of resources, it's shrinking, right? It's not finite, but it's shrinking. We're losing, particularly in the state of Tennessee. The land loss to urbanization is enormous, right? One of the top 5 states in the country for land loss. A lot of our research centers, where when I'm out looking at research cows, seeing the cities, the metropolitan areas that they were a long ways away from a decade ago, get encroached upon, I think is very, very prevalent, right? So again, we're going to be asked to do more, not only with the same amount of resources, but less as we look into the future. There's this potential for changing consumer pressures, right? So right now, our consumers are mostly worried about having a cheap product, right? When we go and my economist friends do all of these analyses of consumer trends, the biggest driver of consumer preference is price, right? They want their beef to be cheap. If their beef's not cheap enough, they're going to go and buy chicken. But there's also subsets of these consumers, and I know that Valerie Bass from the Tennessee Beef Industry Council has talked on one of these webinars as well, sort of about these consumer preferences. But again, in the future, if we see a consumer pressure towards traceability, towards sustainability and verifying that sustainability, these are things that we have to keep in mind as we make decisions on our operation. This consumer ultimately drives what happens at the meat counter and eventually what happens on our farms. Regulations for right now, no major regulations that are impacting us from a sustainability perspective. But I certainly can see situations where in the not so distant future, we're going to have to at least verify that we're doing practices that make our beef production more sustainable, right? NCBA has been working a lot surrounding this idea of waters of the U.S., right? Trying to have some common sense legislation around how our waterways get regulated on our farms, in particular for ranchers and producers. So again, this regulatory burden is not an issue for us in the States right now. I have friends in New Zealand and Ireland and other European countries that are under immense regulatory pressure from their governments to verify sustainable practices, and in some cases improve them or start calling your herds, basically. Again, I'm confident that this won't come in the United States in the same way that it's happened in places like Ireland and New Zealand, but it's something that, again, we have to keep our eye out for and be proactive about telling and getting our sustainability narrative out there in front of not only the media and consumers, but also in front of legislative bodies. But as we think about some other pieces to this sustainability question, our input costs are getting higher, right? This is a big one, and I think we're feeling it harder now than we have in a really long time. It's great to have high cattle prices, but our input prices are also high. When that market sort of drops back to earth a little bit, are these input costs going to go down in the same amount? And if not, how are we able to hedge our bets there? And again, do more with less. That's the ultimate definition of sustainability for me. And again, like I said, volatile markets. I think COVID did if it did anything, it showed us the volatility in the marketplace and how that can really shake what we do as an industry. And as we think about more on the macro scale and looking across the country, extreme weather events are more and more common, right? Hurricanes, droughts, floods. these major shifts and swings in temperature, are our animals able to respond to those effectively? Are our management practices allowing us to again, sort of buffer ourselves from extreme weather events? If not, what can we do to ensure that when these things keep happening, and they are happening more and more, how are we able to respond to those in how we manage these animals? And then I know that Kevin Ferguson from the Center for Farm Management has talked to you about succession plans. But as we think about sustainability in terms of longevity in our operations, being clear about succession planning is really important, right? How do we ensure that this land stays, whether it's with our family or with someone else who's got it in beef production? That's going to be really critical to our industry's sustainability, right? How do we make sure that that this land stays in operation in family farms moving forward? So again, lots of different angles that we can take when we think about sustainability. I want to focus on one, right? And this is something that we hear a lot about. I'm by no means an expert in the greenhouse gas space, but it's something that, again, my research program has started dabbling in a little bit more. But I think it's important that we've got a handle on it. So again, we know how to talk to consumers about it. We know how to frame some of our management decisions that surround this, mostly indirectly. So I'll start off by talking about the thing that makes cattle so important, right? What makes them so amazing, right? They've got this superpower, again, to eat food and turn it, and not just any food, right? But food that we can't eat, right? There's no way that we can go out, munch on that grass and extract anywhere near the nutrients that a cow can, right? And it's actually important to keep in mind that the organ that's doing this, right? As we think about ruminants and what's going on, it's not the cow that produces methane. It's not the cow itself that extracts that energy from forage, right? It's her microbiome, right? And the microbiome is this community of bacteria, protozoa, and fungi that live in a cow's rumen, right? So we've got this four-chambered stomach. That first chamber being the rumen is basically just a big fermentation vat. That cow eats food, it goes in here, and it's really this set of microbiota. We call it a microbiome, right? All these little microbes go in, do a bunch of different biochemical reactions, and are able to turn those inedible forages, all that cellulose, into carbohydrates that the cow is able, again, to use as energy, put that towards muscle growth, which ultimately turns into the high quality protein that we eat in the form of beef, right? So again, this is a pretty amazing thing. This commensal set of microorganisms that's evolved along with ruminants to take advantage of the places that they live. The issue, and this is where all of cattle, if they didn't do this in enteric fermentation, one, they wouldn't be alive, but two, they certainly wouldn't be under the microscope in the context of sustainability. The issue that arises is that cattle, during this enteric fermentation process, they're regurgitating this food, right? They're chewing their cud, but one of the gases that's produced by a subset of this microbiome called methanogens is methane. And methane is a potent greenhouse gas. And again, I'm very far from an Earth or planetary or atmospheric scientist, but I'll walk you through basically what methane is, what greenhouse gases are, and sort of where cows fit into this picture, right? So again, this is Troy's explained to a third grader about the atmosphere, but we've got an atmosphere around Earth, right? The atmosphere's major role in what allows life to exist on Earth is that it's able to block the rays of the sun from just frying us alive, right? If we didn't have the atmosphere, we'd all just be sizzling on the Earth's surface, right? Water wouldn't be able to exist. So the atmosphere is really important, right? And what it does is that when the sun shines down, most of the sun doesn't actually reach us, right? Just a very small amount reaches Earth. Most of it's absorbed by the atmosphere. But what happens in the context of these greenhouse gases, methane, carbon dioxide, a handful of other gases, they get in the atmosphere and they break down that ozone layer, right? That layer of the atmosphere that bounces those sun's rays back to us. So as these greenhouse gases break those down, that basically means that more sunlight is reaching the earth, which causes a rise in global temperatures, right? Again, that's my sort of 10,000 foot view of what happens here. We've known that this happens for a long time, and we know that cows play at least a little bit of a part in the emission of methane. But here's where I think our definitions from the beef industry differ a little bit from what maybe gets reported by the media and other climate scientists. So methane as a total is 16% of greenhouse gas equivalents that get emitted globally. So again, the vast majority of this comes from in the form of burning fossil fuels. This little yellow slot is the methane. So a relatively small chunk of the grand total is methane. But as we think about beef cattle in particular, right, how much of this chunk of total emissions is coming from livestock production, in particular from our industry? So what they find out, folks have done some of these analyses and say that livestock globally accounts for about 11% of the global greenhouse gas emission. So again, that's a non-negligible, but not enormous chunk of the grand total. But when we start to frame this towards what we're doing in the United States, and again, this will come back to an efficiency talk here in a minute, cattle account for only 4% of greenhouse gases in the United States. So again, we're accounting for far less of the greenhouse gas emission compared to other industries and sources in the United States. And beef cattle produce only about half of that grand total here in the US. So again, the slice of this pie that the beef industry is responsible for is really, really small. And so again, as we start to look at where these issues come from, right? From the media, from outside interest groups, right? I know a lot of groups that would really like to shift the blame of greenhouse gas emissions away from their industries and towards something like beef cattle, right? 2.2%. That's a number that I'd love for you to throw in your back pocket. So when you're having a conversation about how much cattle are contributing to this issue of greenhouse gas emission, it's very, very small in the grand scheme of things. So a great way I think for us to frame this is yes, our cattle are emitting a potent greenhouse gas, but it's a very, very small piece of the picture. And the most important thing I think is that cattle aren't they're not a factory, right? We're not taking fossil fuel that's been locked away in the earth for, thousands and thousands and thousands and millions of years, right? They're part of this, what we call a biogenic carbon cycle, right? So cattle are emitting methane, right? And that methane, I'll come to this in a subsequent slide, doesn't stick around forever, right? It eventually gets broken down into carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide is actually used in the photosynthesis process by the grass that these cows eat, right? So the grass is sequestering and utilizing this carbon dioxide that at some point originated from methane, right? So it's a circular system, right? And these cows aren't just belching methane into the atmosphere, but they're eating this grass that's actually going through and fixing carbon from the atmosphere again. So when we think about this as a sort of closed system, it becomes apparent that cattle aren't just raw emitters, but rather this might be something that's a little bit closer to neutral when we think about the overall output of the system. If you just look at raw emissions from cows and don't account for the service that their ecosystem plays in fixing carbon, I think it's easy to sort of lose sight of things and how cattle and in particularly the grazing system is actually probably a net positive when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions rather than being a major emitter. And I'll briefly touch on this idea of being a flow versus a stock gas. This is getting a little bit in the weeds, but it's important to sort of distinguish between methane, which is more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. But the issue is that carbon dioxide takes forever to break down, right? Thousands of years, it will stay in the atmosphere, whereas methane will break down in just about 12 years, right? So methane is a really short-lived gas. They don't stay around for very long, and it's breaking down if we've got the same number of cows, right? The methane that they're emitting into the environment is breaking down at the same rate that they're emitting it, right? So the level of methane that's in the environment as a result of the beef industry is more or less steady. Whereas when we think about burning fossil fuels, this is cumulative, right? It's sticking around for the long term in the atmosphere. And again, I don't want to go too far in the weeds with this, but basically, we can't treat carbon dioxide, again, which is what results from burning fossil fuels, the same way that we do methane in the context of being a greenhouse gas. And the important thing too is that U.S. beef production has a 16% lower greenhouse gas footprint than it did 40 years ago, right? So we're decreasing our emissions, and methane doesn't stick around in the atmosphere forever like carbon dioxide is. So again, so we think about its contribution to emissions and to potential warming effects. Methane emitted by the beef industry is just a tiny bit, and it's much less impactful than these cumulative gases that are emitted due to burning fossil fuels. Okay, so that's all that I've got about greenhouse gas emissions for the most part. I really want to focus for the rest of the time here on a more holistic view of sustainability. And so I'll mention a group that's been a partner of the UT Master Beef Program for a long time, and a really helpful organization, I think, for communicating the beef industry's efforts towards sustainability and a really holistic sustainability, that being the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And what USRSB is a big multi-stakeholder group of commodity folks, so folks that are producers, folks that are involved in animal health, in the feedlot space, in the packer space, and in the retail space. They're really focused on finding areas that we can increase our sustainability, but also communicating to consumers how we're doing our continuous improvement throughout the value chain. And what they've done, and what I'll focus on here for a little bit, are high priority targets for increasing our more holistic sustainability. Again, moving past just this idea of air and greenhouse gas emissions, but also thinking about land and water resources, very important for us as we move forward and try and keep this industry around, but also about the human element, the animal health element, and ultimately what I'll talk probably the most about, efficiency and yield, right? Knowing that we have to keep efficiency in mind as we think about a more holistic sustainability. So what they do is they break this out into some focus areas, and that they give sort of directives, things that can be achieved that directly address these main focus areas. So as we think about environmental and resource sustainability, we know a handful of things about this that affects their sort of directives. One is that growing grass is fixing more carbon than sort of stagnant or dead grass. We know that well-managed forages are able to minimize runoff and erosion. So the better we manage our forages, the more soil nutrients we're going to keep around there. And if we manage our forage better, we're going to have more feed. That's going to allow us to make more beef per unit of land. And to me, that's our ultimate measure of efficiency, our ultimate measure of sustainability. And so USRSB's suggested action is to, if you don't already, establish a grazing management plan. That entails a handful of things, and I'm far from a grazing scientist. If Dr. Mason were here, she'd have some more concrete things for you to think about. But really what a grazing management plan is evaluating your forage base, doing some sort of an inventory, understanding that soil health, and implementing practices that allow you to maintain those soil nutrients, right? Rotational grazing being a big part of this, but also planning for seasonal deficiencies in forage. If you maybe plant a cover crop, right? How are we able to balance those cold and warm season grasses? But again, having a grazing management plan in a really big way touches all of these environmental and resource sustainability pieces, and it's something that we can all implement really right now. They also have a couple pieces of guidance for animal and human well-being that are really centered on livestock stewardship. So, how do we minimize stress on animals, and how do we minimize health events on our operations? Right. Healthier herds need less interventions. Right. That saves us money. That makes us more profitable. But it also makes us better stewards of antibiotics, right? That's been a really, really big issue that Dr. Strickland, I'm sure you've heard him, our state extension vet, talk lots about. We're having to be better stewards of our antibiotics. How do we create environments for our animals that are easier on the handlers, right? How do we make ourselves more, I guess, less likely to have something adverse occur, but also on the animals, right? Low stress handling, so on and so forth. And so USRSB's suggested action again is training individuals on stockmanship and receiving a formal beef quality assurance training. Okay, so this really, I think, again, underlines this idea that what we're talking about in master beef, right? And as you get certified for beef quality assurance, this is really in line with being more efficient, but also with being more sustainable. They've identified these as the major areas that we can improve our industry sustainability. Is low stress animal handling, evaluating animals for sickness and disease, and caring for them appropriately, but also all of these production practices that enhance animal well-being. A healthy animal is a more productive animal, and that more productive animal is going to end up with a higher quality end product. So again, these are all things that we're doing right now, but the USRSB has really helped to amplify all the good work that we're doing as an industry that has an end impact on the sustainability of our product. And so, again, measuring sustainability by raw emissions is something that a lot of folks love to do, but I think it's really irresponsible, and I think that it misses the point completely. We have to be able to measure all of these sustainability metrics by productivity. The example I'll give is a couple of vehicles maybe that you're familiar with. This is an early 90s F-350. It's got a V10 engine on it, right? These things were absolute beasts in a 2023 Toyota Prius, right? And if we think about this in the same way that we think about raw emissions, right? I could say that I used a gallon of gas in each of these two vehicles, right? The difference, and this is when we don't think about this in the context of productivity, this gallon of gas maybe got my Prius 60 miles, right? I did some serious traveling with this investment of gas, right? This gallon of gas maybe got my 1994 Ford F-350 V10 to pull out of the driveway, right? So again, we have to scale all of this, right? Fuel use isn't the same thing as fuel efficiency. And just in the same way, emissions or sustainability isn't the same thing as emissions scaled by productivity, or emissions scaled, or sustainability scaled by productivity. Again, I think that our most clear path towards a sustainable product is an efficient product. So again, I always pull this slide up because I think it's really impactful, right? We're producing the same amount of beef as we were in 1977 with 33% less cows, okay? We are as efficient and sustainable as ever. This is a major win for us that we need to be talking about with our consumers and with each other. And I think the promise here too is that we're not done improving, right? We haven't maxed out our efficiency as an industry. There are lots of areas that we can continue to become more efficient. And I think that those are our best stories that we can tell from a sustainability perspective, have to do with our ability to do more or do the same amount with less cows and less input resources. So again, these things are all friends with each other, right? And I think that efficiency is the piece that pulls these together. If we're more efficient, we're more profitable. If we're more efficient, we're more sustainable. I really don't think that these things are working counter to one another. And so USRSB also has this as a major emphasis area: efficiency and yield. So how do we minimize inputs for the same amount of output? How do we account for environmental impacts scaled by productivity? Again, We can think about greenhouse gas emissions, but we better be scaling them by how productive our system is. And a more efficient animal is going to be more sustainable. So they have a suggested action, which is basically do all the things that we talk about in the UT Master Beef program, right? And again, this is our most clear-cut way to be a more sustainable industry, is to continue particularly reducing idle animal units. This is one that I think a lot about from a profitability standpoint. I talk about reproductive efficiency and how we can do genetic selection for animals that are more reproductively efficient, because the profitability of a cow that doesn't have a calf is definitely in the negative, right? You're paying to keep that animal around, but it's idle. It's not making any sort of end product. So if we can reduce the number of idle animal units through an increased calving rate, through lower culling rates, longer lived cows, right? This is how we make a really big impact, not only on our sustainability as an industry, but on our overall productivity and profitability. So again, this is nothing different than what we've talked about in Master Beef for decades, right? All of these things that make us more productive make our industry more sustainable. And again, lots of ways that this has happened: higher quality feedstuffs, better rations, better grazing management techniques, lowering environmental stress, improved animal genetics. I'm biased, but this is a big one where we're continuing to improve our animals, put animals out there that are more effectively able to leverage their resources into productivity. Getting those animals bred, right? Open cows are awfully unprofitable, and they're not great for the environment either, because there's not that in beef product to tie back to what their impact and their intake is, and just faster growing animals, right? The quicker an animal gets finished, the less days on feed, the less we pay to get that animal finished, and the lower that animal's overall environmental impact would be. I always think it's helpful to frame this in a couple of different ways. Traditionally, I think we think about our operations as an X number of cows unit, and then we scale our efficiency based on how much weaned calf weight or feedlot or carcass performance, whatever our endpoint might be. We scale that, basically divide this total number by the number of cows, and we say, we're this efficient, right? But I think the more important and impactful way to think about this is to scale based on our forage resources, right? How much weaned calf weight are we able to get out of this fixed amount of land, right? This fixed amount of pasture. Again, they're not making any more of this, folks. This is from our Middle Tennessee Ag Research Center. Anybody who's been over by Spring Hill knows that this is a very, very different place than it was 20 years ago. We've got housing development. We've got the city of Spring Hill. I mean, a shopping center is right here, housing development down here, and a giant battery-powered Cadillac plant all up and down this side, right? So again, this is a microcosm of a bigger challenge that we're all facing in the state of Tennessee, right? How do we maximize this land, right? While also keeping in mind that we've got to keep this around for generations to come, right? So again, this is a really important piece, and it comes down to maximizing that forage base, right? Knowing what our carrying capacity is and managing it as such. Maybe we need some smaller cows on there, right? Maybe we need less cows, okay? So that we're not depleting this soil of its nutrients, so that forage base can stay around. Lots of ways that we can manage that better. I don't have nearly enough time to dive into those. I'm going to skip through a little bit of this and get to some closing thoughts. But again, lots of ways to think about this idea of sustainability. But I always keep going back to this idea that efficiency is going to be the major driver of it. And so I want to leave with a few talking points. So when we're talking to a consumer, you've sat down somewhere and somebody starts talking to you about what you do as a beef producer, right? How do we talk to consumers about sustainable beef production? The first thing that I start out with is that we're the world's most efficient beef production system. So this is a little bit dated, but I think still really summarizes the state of things across the world. So in red, we've got beef production. In blue, we've got the number of cows that exist, right? So as we look at ourselves, we are the biggest producer of beef in the world, but we're doing it with the same number of cows that China is, right? And they're producing significantly less beef, right? We think about Brazil, right? A really rapidly growing beef production system. They're producing a lot of beef, but they have almost 3 times as many cows as we do, right? They're nowhere near where we are from a production standpoint. We're doing more in the United States with less. But then as we think about the sustainability challenges, right, and we look at some of these less productive systems, right, we go to sub-Saharan Africa, India, places where there are lots of cows, but their beef production is very inefficient, right? There are some major efficiency gaps that these countries have to make up. They're working on it. These are developing economies. But as we think about globally, again, that's 11% or whatever of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from livestock. Our best focus there would be on making these systems more efficient, right? We're doing the efficiency above and beyond in the U.S. and more, right? So again, shifting that context is really, really important. So some of this is pulled from the Beef Checkoff Sustainability Analysis, where something like 10 to 50 times lower carbon footprints for a pound of beef produced in the United States versus a pound of beef produced in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, just a function of our production systems. And so along those same lines, removing cattle from efficient systems is the worst thing that you can do for sustainability. People still want to eat beef, okay? And if we say, all right, this is something that's been happening fairly recently, the Irish government proposed culling 200,000 cows to meet their country's climate goals, right? So that's fine if Ireland wants to get across the finish line, right? That's, whatever. But what's going to happen when the same number of people want to drink milk and eat beef, right? That production is going to shift to another place in the world, right? It's probably going to shift to a place like Brazil. Okay, that's a much less efficient system than what the Irish are doing, right? So this is what we would call carbon leakage, right? So one country that's very, very efficient de-incentivizes production. That production shifts to a less efficient system. And what that ends up doing is it raises the overall environmental footprint of the milk and cheese and meat that Irish folks eat, right? This luckily hasn't gotten pushed through to be final, right? But again, this is the sort of pressure that other countries are under to demonstrate their sustainability, and in some cases, some very, very extreme proposals to handle it. I think that in the United States, again, our biggest strength is that we're so efficient, and being sure that we tell that to the world is super important. Important to state that grasslands are an essential ecosystem. They cover huge amounts of the world, right? And cattle and other ruminants are the only ways that we can turn these grasslands into high quality human food products, right? There's big chunks of South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, North America. Anywhere you look, you're going to find grasslands. Cattle are able to upcycle this into a human edible, high quality food product. And then, as cattle being the last truly extensive livestock species, we are awesome environmental stewards, and these cows are very, very different. I don't think that you can understate the cultural and heritage value of beef production. Again, we're an industry of family-owned farms, right? And I'm very, very devoted to making sure that it stays that way. One of our biggest strengths and one of our best talking points for producers is that we're out here as family farms trying to stay sustainable economically, longevity wise, but also at the same time being good stewards of our environment. And the last thing I'll leave you with is a geneticist. I'm always thinking about genetic improvement over time, right? And as an industry, we're making enormous progress in doing more with less. Again, more beef, less cows, and this is only getting better as our practices and our breeding techniques get better and better. So I'll leave you with a couple of resources here that I drew on a ton. I'd like to thank each of these individual web pages as I branched out into an area that's very different from my typical talk. This is Beef Checkoff Research, has some really great infographics that are focused on sustainability. The Clear Center at UC Davis, as well as the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef's framework, guided a lot of what I talked about. With that, I'll leave some takeaways here on the screen. I know that I'm right up against time, but encourage you to reach out with questions via email or phone, whatever works. And we've got some funding to look at cow efficiency and sustainability phenotypes that I didn't have time to present, but would love to talk about that more at another time. So with that, I will turn it over. If Mallory has any questions from the chat box, I'm happy to answer those, but appreciate everybody hopping on a Tuesday night and listening to a topic that's maybe a little bit different.
All right, good deal. Thank you, Dr. Rowan. We really appreciate you coming on and being here with us tonight. I think we've just got a couple of comments in the Q&A box if you want to address those. But other than that, I don't see any more. I think we have some typing maybe.
Let's see. I can't read all of them. Great information. Sudan Sudex is a carbon capture. I think that's again, I'm so far, that'd be a Mallory question. She's our resident forage expert tonight, in the absence of Dr. Mason. I know that there's a lot of work that's going on in the sustainability space, thinking about what forages are maybe able to do more carbon capture, but also on the other side, thinking about how does the forage that an animal intakes affect their emissions. So I can't speak specifically to Sudan Sudex as a carbon capture method, but certainly an area that the forage research team here at UT is thinking a lot about.
I agree with that 100%. I'm not as well versed on the carbon capture side of things, but being one of those warm season grasses, either Dr. Kaiser or Dr. Mason would certainly be able to address that one much better than me.
For sure. You see any other questions, Mallory? I'm not sure if I'm looking on the right box, but
You're good. One more. What would you consider landmark papers?
Landmark papers. That's a good question. There are some good. I think it's important to understand some of the original papers that sort of started this whole sustainability movement in the beef cattle world. So there was a UN report that came out in 2011 that I think is one of the big things that people will continue to reference. Some of their numbers were a little bit off, but a paper that I think is important to understand sort of how this global beef system sort of got underneath the microscope. There are tons of references from the UC Davis Clear Center. Frank Mithloner is the professor that runs that, and he's sort of been the voice for beef cattle and dairy cattle sustainability, and he's got some really, really good work. Other work from Sarah Place, who is a professor at Colorado State University in their Ag Next Center. She does some really great work on the feedlot and cow-calf sector. I don't have papers right off the bat, but hopefully that guides you down a couple of pathways to learning more about the subject. And in all of those resources that I put up, I can send those out as well too. There's lots of great papers that get referenced in reports in each of those. So that'd be my best answer as far as a lit review goes.
And I think that's the last one that we have in the chat or in the Q&A box right now. If anybody has any more, we'd be happy to address those tonight. But if not, I think we're done. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Dr. Rowan or Dr. Mason, and we'll get those covered for you. We're super excited that you joined us here again tonight for the webinar series, and we certainly appreciate Dr. Rowan for joining us to talk more about sustainability. So with all that being said, we'll wrap up tonight. We'll see everyone again on Thursday. Thank you, Dr. Rowan.
Great. Thanks for having me, Mallory. Thanks everybody for sticking around.